Hi guys, welcome to another episode of U.S. History with Lennox, and today we're looking at the presidency of Richard Nixon. Now, if you've been with me in any of my previous videos, you know that Nixon has been around since the late 1940s. As a junior congressman from the state of California, he will serve on the House of Un-American Activities Committee, right in the midst of the Red Scare and McCarthyism. From there, he'll move on to the U.S. Senate, which will give him a launching point to the vice presidency under Dwight D. Eisenhower. In 1960, Richard Nixon will take his own run at the presidency when he faces off with John F. Kennedy, unsuccessfully. But he's not done, because he'll come back in 1968 when he will win the presidency. Now, Nixon, going into the late 60s, is facing a brand new America, one that didn't exist when he ran in 1960. You see, during the 1960s, America became much more liberal, both politically, economically, and socially. We see that during the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson when he introduces the Great Society, an extension of New Deal policies that started under Franklin Roosevelt in the 40s. Society, we're going to see the rise of the women's movement, the growth of the civil rights movement, and a whole new view of what the family should look like. All of this is going to face Nixon when he comes into office. But during his campaign, he's going to introduce a shift back to conservative values going into the 1970s. And it will be what he deems the silent majority that brings an election victory to him. Now, as we get into his second term, there's going to be a lot of controversy, a lot of turmoil. But that's for our next video. In this one, let me introduce you to President Richard Nixon. Now, as I said, when Nixon came into office, he brought a shift to a more conservative America. During the 1960s, we had become quite liberal, not only in our politics, but in our economics and in society as well. And so Nixon and the Republicans want to shift it back towards the middle. Fiscally, what this looked like was to limit government spending. We had seen a blank check basically given to Lyndon B. Johnson with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, as well as his Great Society. So the conservatives and the Republicans wanted to rein that in. They also wanted to reduce the taxes of the average American. Socially, there was a feel that the moral values of the Americans had dissipated, and the conservatives wanted to bring those back. And they were focused on some changes that had taken place with regards to how we viewed our families, how we viewed our schools. There was this fear in America that due to a lot of the economic policies that were introduced during the early and mid-60s, that we were actually drifting towards communism. And that scared people. So when Nixon ran, he ran on this idea that this Cold War that we'd been fighting since the end of World War II was a battle between good and evil, and he was intent on winning that war. What we're being introduced to at this point is what's known as neoconservatism, or the New Right. You're going to see the rejection of a lot of the protest movements of the 1960s and 70s. You're going to see a renewed focus on capitalism, creating a balanced budget within government, and lowering taxes. The idea was most Americans wanted a smaller government. They wanted less government welfare programs, and they wanted our military to remain strong. The big thing that's going to be introduced under neoconservatism is this idea of a balanced budget, that our government should have to run on a budget. And if the money's not there, they can't spend it. Well, we all know the truth about government spending. They're going to spend it whether it's there or not. But the promise of a balanced budget, man, that sounds good. And then there was a look at what was, quote, right in the USA, and this idea that we needed to return to family values. Jerry Falwell is going to introduce what's known as the moral majority. And they're going to fight for the return of things such as prayer in school, which had been removed during the late 60s. They're also going to support ideas such as the death penalty. That's that law and order feeling that conservatives had going into the 1970s. When you look at the election map of 1968, it's going to mark a shift in American politics. We started in the 60s with this era of optimism with John F. Kennedy, but as the decade went on, we saw our level of distrust in the government grow, and we also saw the government start all these new movements and all these new programs, and it was costing us a lot of money. So you're going to have this pushback against government by the time we get to 68. On the domestic front, Nixon's policies became known as New Federalism. Now remember, federalism is the idea of the division of power between states and a central government. Conservatives felt like the central government had gained too much power. So what Nixon wanted to do was eliminate some of these federal programs and give the money from those programs to the states to use as they saw fit. Because what Nixon was claiming is the idea that state government agencies, even local government agencies, have a better opportunity to recognize what the people of their region needed. The further you get away from Washington, D.C., the harder it is to see what the people want. And that was Nixon's argument. Now, this whole idea was based on this theory of revenue sharing, where federal revenue, federal monies, would be filtered down to both the state and local levels. The problem is, somewhere in the middle, the money got held up and it didn't reach the people that Nixon promised it would. Also domestically, Nixon is going to have a huge impact when he is able to appoint 3 members to the Supreme Court due to other justices resigning or passing away. Warren Burger will come on in 1969, and William Rehnquist and Lewis Powell will enter the court in 1971. Remember, court appointments are lifetime appointments. We can go all the way back to 1800 and John Adams and his midnight appointments. There is power in the courts. So if a single president can appoint 3 justices to the Supreme Court, no matter how long he or she stays in office, the influence of his vision for our country is going to be there for a long time, because you realize presidents are going to appoint justices that align with their values. Really, where Nixon is going to make his mark is with foreign affairs. He is still to this day hailed for his foreign affairs savvy and how he dealt with the rest of the world. And one major reason for this is Henry Kissinger, who was his Secretary of State. Now, we had faced crises throughout the world since the 1950s. In 1956, when Nixon was the vice president, we saw tensions escalate when Egypt tried to nationalize the Suez Canal. This will, of course, lead to a war between Egypt, Israel, the UK, and France. In the end, under pressure from the UN and the United States, they're all going to back down. And Nixon was right on the sidelines for this. These tensions are going to continue into the 1960s, and they will escalate during Nixon's presidency. We're going to see several occasions where fighting will break out between Israel and other Arab countries. One example is the Six-Day War fought in 1967. Now, this is prior to Nixon coming into office, but it's setting the stage. This war was fought between Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria over control of specific lands in the Middle East. This war will lead to Israel taking control of the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. Several years later, the Yom Kippur War is going to be fought, where Egypt and Syria are going to retaliate against Israel. After this war, Egypt is going to regain control of the Sinai Peninsula, and Syria will start to reclaim parts of the Golan Heights. Throughout all of this, America was aligned with Israel. And the more conflicts that occurred, the stronger our bond between us and the Israelis grew. Because of this, the tension grew between the United States and some of these Arab nations. But through all of this, really the biggest foreign policy that Nixon had to deal with when he came into office in 1969 is the Vietnam War. It's still going on. Now, Nixon had promised during his campaign that he would bring the war to an end. In fact, he and Kissinger came up with this plan called Peace with Honor. And that's what he promised the American people. I'm going to end this war, but I'm going to do it honorably. This is going to lead to the Nixon Doctrine. And under the Nixon Doctrine, America says, you know what, we're going to honor all the treaty commitments we have in Asia at this point. However, moving forward, Asia can depend on us to help them in case of a major nuclear threat, but they shouldn't rely on the United States sending ground troops over anymore. This was all part of Nixon's Vietnamization plan, turning over the war to the Vietnam people and pulling Americans out. Now, this is what Nixon campaigned on. And he campaigned on that believing that there was a silent majority in America. These were the people that still supported the U.S. role in Vietnam and in containment for that matter. They also were Americans who paid taxes, they would not demonstrate, and they desired this restoration of law and order. You just didn't hear from them. They just went about their day-to-day lives, doing their job, paying their taxes. They didn't get involved in all the other stuff. And that's why we called them the silent majority. And Nixon believed there was more of them than those who were doing the protesting. During his presidency, he is going to notice that tension is starting to rise between Russia and China. And so what he is going to try to do is create a friendlier relationship with both countries. We call it detente, which means cooperation. And Nixon and Kissinger are going to go into their foreign affairs policy trying to create a scenario of detente with some of our strongest adversaries in the world. Let's talk about China first. Nixon is going to work to reopen relationships with China, and he will actually become the first president of the United States to ever visit that country. It was called ping pong diplomacy. I love that name. This occurred when our U.S. ping pong team was in Japan. While there, they got an invitation to visit China and play against their national ping pong team. Well, the United States lost. But what this did was it opened up a door for Nixon to enter into talks with China. Nixon will meet with Mao in what was known as the Sino-American relations. And after 2 decades of a very adversarial relationship, we started to see a normalization between our two countries. The strategic arms limitation talks is another big foreign policy win for Nixon. This is going to involve the United States and the Soviet Union, and it will be a summit between our two countries where we will both agree to limit our nuclear arms, limit the amount of nuclear weapons that we were creating. It's known as the SALT talks. And between 1972 and 1974, tension between us and the Soviet Union were quite calm, a little bit eased. We could breathe a little bit more. So it should be no surprise when we go into the election of 1972 that Nixon won in a rout, which is fascinating because as big as he won, he still felt like he had to cheat. And that will be our next video when we look at the downfall of Richard Nixon. Well, hopefully you learned a little bit about Nixon and his presidency. As we go forward, you're going to find out why Americans look back at Nixon as one of the worst presidents in history. But until then, if you learned something, go ahead and give me a like. If you want to, feel free to subscribe. But we'll see you on the next one. I thank you for watching. Bye-bye.